Hey, Sarah. Josh Norwood says every piece of his heart and soul died Friday night after finding his wife and 6-year-old son dead inside their house.
It was a typical February day in Virginia, cool but not too harsh, with gusts of wind that shook the leafless branches of the trees. On this day, February 14th, 2020, Valentine's Day was celebrated everywhere in the country. The streets of the cities were decorated with hearts and flowers, shop windows sparkled with festive lights, and it seemed that the whole world was enveloped in an atmosphere of love and care. For Josh Norwood, a 37-year-old man, this holiday has always been special. Every February 14th, he tried to do something nice for his family, something that would show them his love and affection. That day, Josh left work, as usual, around 5 in the evening. His workday was standard, unremarkable: reports, calls, work meetings. The only deviation from the routine was that he, like many other men that day, stopped at a small flower shop on his way home. The bouquet of bright scarlet roses was intended for his wife, Jen, a 34-year-old woman who has been his faithful companion and mother of their 2 children for many years. He smiled, imagining how Jen would be delighted with the flowers when he returned home. They had a cozy house in rural Virginia, away from the hustle and bustle of cities, surrounded by nature and silence. This is the kind of life they have always wanted for themselves and their sons. At the entrance to the house, Josh noted that everything looked normal, no fuss or extraneous signs of anxiety. He parked his car in the driveway in front of the house, walked up the steps to the door, and then for the first time, something alerted him. The curtains on the windows were drawn. It wasn't an emergency, but it wasn't exactly common for their house either. They usually kept the windows open, letting in natural light. Maybe Jen decided to take a break with the kids, Josh thought, trying to ward off the first signs of anxiety. Opening the door, he stepped into the house and felt a strange silence. On normal days, when he returned from work, he was always greeted by his youngest son, 6-year-old Wyatt. The boy loved to run out into the hallway shouting, "Daddy's back!" But this time, Wyatt didn't show up, which made Josh wary.
Now, Josh Norwood wrote, "I opened my door, and before my work bag hit the floor, I was shot in the head."
He walked a few steps inside the house, and at the same moment he heard a dull pop. Shot. Everything was mixed up in front of his eyes, and before he realized what had happened, he felt a sharp pain in his head. Josh instinctively clutched his forehead and felt something warm and sticky flow down his face. It was blood. The bullet passed by casually, leaving a deep cut on his forehead, but did not pierce his skull. The pain was searing, but Josh was overwhelmed not by a sense of his own safety, but by the thought of what was happening to his family. His heart was pounding wildly as he rushed through the house in search of his loved ones. His first impulse was to check the bedroom of his eldest son, Levi. A 17-year-old boy usually spent his evenings in his room, doing his own business or getting ready for school. Josh ran into Levi's room, but Levi wasn't there. The light was on. The bed was slightly rumpled, but there was no sign of his son's presence. Levi seemed to have disappeared. A growing sense of anxiety and panic pushed Josh to the next room, the living room. Here, his gaze immediately fell on a disorderly pile of blankets piled on the sofa. Josh's heart skipped a beat. He took a step forward and, grabbing one of the blankets, abruptly threw it aside. His wife, Jan, was lying under him. She was motionless, lying face down, and a pool of blood had already begun to spread around her body, which penetrated into the carpet under her. The shock was so intense that for a second, Josh thought he was seeing a nightmare from which he was about to wake up. He couldn't grasp the reality of what he was seeing. His thoughts were spinning wildly in his head, and the only thing he could say at that moment was, "No." The word echoed in the empty house. Shaking with fear, Josh turned his head and saw another stack of blankets on the small couch they called the love seat. His inner voice screamed, anticipating the worst. He tore off the blanket, revealing the terrible truth. His youngest son, Wyatt, was under it. The boy also showed no signs of life. His body was cold, and his face was motionless. For a while, Josh just froze, staring at this terrible sight. His world collapsed in an instant, and each new look at the bodies of his loved ones only increased his sense of despair. But at that moment, despite the horror, his instincts took over. He knew he had to do something. He pulled out a pistol, which he always carried with him for self-defense, and pointed it towards the basement, from where, according to his guesses, the bullet that wounded him flew. He fired several bullets in that direction, not knowing exactly where the threat was coming from, but trying to protect himself and his family. Realizing that his strength was running out, Josh rushed out of the house, running out to the road. Luck was on his side. A car was passing by at that moment. He rushed to the car, waving his arms, and the driver, noticing a bloodied and clearly in need of help man, stopped. Moments later, a passerby called the police, and Josh, exhausted from pain and shock, could only exhale briefly. Help! After leaving the house, Josh Norwood found himself on the side of the road. His breathing was ragged and the pain in his head was getting worse every moment. Bloodied and confused, he could barely stand on his feet, and all that pushed him forward was the instinct of salvation. He knew it was dangerous to stay in the house, but thoughts of what had happened to his family tormented his mind. As he rushed onto the road, a passing car appeared in his field of vision. The driver, noticing the man, bloodied and clearly in a state of shock, stopped the car without hesitation. Once next to him, he immediately called the emergency services, barely restraining himself from panicking at the sight of the wounded man. Through the sounds of the wind and noises, Josh could only utter a few words. "My family. They're there. In the house." His voice was full of despair and pain. The driver wasted no time passing the information to the 911 dispatcher, who immediately dispatched police and an ambulance to the scene. While the cars with flashing lights were already speeding along the deserted rural road, Josh felt his strength running out with every second. Blood continued to flow from his forehead, pulsing under the pressure of the wound. He sat down on the side of the road. His hands were shaking, and thoughts were swarming in his head. He was barely aware of what was happening. The reality that his wife and son were dead was simply unbearable. All that remained in his mind was a feeling of guilt and fear. Where was Levi? What happened? When police and medical services arrived at the scene, the area around Josh Norwood's house was immediately cordoned off. Officers were getting out of their cars, ready for a possible collision with the perpetrator, who could still be in the house. They approached Josh first, giving him first aid. The medics bandaged his wound, calming him down, but he was still in a state of shock, continuing to mutter, "Where's Levi? Where is he?" These words caused the police to first suspect that the situation could be more complicated than it initially seemed. While the medical staff continued to work with Josh, the police slowly and carefully entered the house. From the very first steps, they felt the heavy, suffocating atmosphere that was in the air. There was an ominous silence inside, broken only by the faint echo of their footsteps. The house seemed dead, as if abandoned by life, and this feeling only intensified when they stepped into the living room. The first thing they saw was the body of Jan Norwood. She was lying face down on the floor in a pool of blood. Her long hair was matted and stained with a dark red liquid that had already begun to dry on the carpet. Her posture was unnatural. Her arms were casually spread out and her body was slightly twisted, as if she had suddenly fallen and did not even have time to try to defend herself. There were household items scattered on the floor next to her, but there were no signs of a struggle. She seemed to have been shot suddenly, without the possibility of resistance. The police, seeing her motionless body, immediately called for doctors, but it was obvious that Jen had been dead for a long time. As the investigators got closer, they noticed a second tragic detail. Another body was hiding on a small love seat under a blanket. Josh mentioned his youngest son, Wyatt, and unfortunately, The police guesses turned out to be correct. A 6-year-old boy was shot in the chest. His face, which had been so animated and joyful before, was now frozen in eternal calm. Wyatt seemed to be covered in a blanket. Perhaps someone was trying to create the illusion that the boy was asleep, but this was only a cruel deception. Investigators made the first conclusion. The perpetrator probably knew the victims and was a part of their lives. The scene was eerily quiet, but none of the police officers let their guard down. The next task was to examine the entire house for traces that could help uncover the circumstances of this horrific crime. The important fact was that the house showed no signs of forced entry. The front door was not damaged. The windows were closed and locked. This meant that the perpetrator had not entered the house by force. Most likely, he had been there from the very beginning. The police noticed the door leading to the basement. Josh mentioned that he fired towards the basement when he heard the first shot that wounded him. Realizing that the threat could come from there, the two officers carefully went down. The basement was dark and damp, lit only by a few dim lamps, but their attention was immediately attracted by several details that showed that someone had been here recently. There were footprints on the basement floor left by shoes that clearly did not belong to Josh or Jan. There was a small pack of cartridges on the old wooden table, the same cartridges that were used for shooting in the house. It was one of the key pieces of evidence that immediately became the focus of investigators' attention. But the most important thing is that the weapon from which the shots were fired was missing. This discovery suggested that the shooter could still be at large, perhaps somewhere nearby. As the investigators examined the house, they realized more and more that a carefully planned crime had occurred here. The shots were fired at close range, and judging by the wounds on the bodies, the perpetrator acted quickly and coolly. Jen was killed by the first shot in the back, probably while she was sitting on the floor or doing some household chores. Bullet marks and blood confirmed this version. Wyatt, apparently, was killed right after his mother. His small body did not have time to react to the threat, but the main question that plagued the police and Josh remained unresolved. Where was Levi? The eldest son, a 17-year-old teenager, was supposed to be at home, but he was not at the crime scene. His room was empty, although the traces of his stay were obvious. The bed was rumpled. Educational materials were scattered on the table. However, there were no signs of a struggle or abduction. It seemed that Levi had simply disappeared, leaving behind elusive traces. Police immediately began searching for Levi, interviewing the teenager's neighbors and friends. While some of the investigators continued to work at the crime scene, another group set off in the footsteps of his personal life. They contacted the school, talked to Levi's teachers and classmates, trying to figure out what could have made him disappear at such a critical moment. As investigators delved into the Norwood family's personal files, they began to notice something strange. Outwardly, the family seemed perfect. Josh and Jen were happily married, took care of the children, and Levi, at first glance, was an ordinary teenager. However, beneath the surface of this ideal relationship, there were problems that could shed light on what happened. Levi's closest friends told the police that the guy had been under intense emotional stress in the last few months. He complained about problems in his relationship with his parents, especially with his father. In conversations with friends, he mentioned his desire to escape from home, that he felt misunderstood and lonely. These revelations, which previously seemed like simple teenage complaints, have now begun to raise serious concerns among investigators. While the search for Levi continued, the first assumptions began to form at the police station. Could Levi have witnessed the murder? Or is his disappearance somehow connected with the crime? These issues have become key in the further actions of the police. The reality that the Norwood's eldest son was either a key witness or a possible participant in the crime began to become increasingly frightening. Investigators were now working on two versions. The first, Levi could have been kidnapped or killed, and the perpetrator may have taken him with him. The second, The guy could have been involved in these murders himself, and his disappearance was not accidental. As the police interviewed Levi's friends and acquaintances, more and more disturbing facts surfaced. One of the teenager's friends, whom Levi trusted more than the others, admitted that Levi had recently said that he could no longer live in this house. He complained about constant conflicts with his father and felt that no one understood him. He was a teenager in a state of deep internal conflict. Moreover, some of his statements touched on dark, disturbing thoughts. Levi talked about violence and even death, but his friends did not take it seriously, believing that it was just an expression of anger characteristic of his age. These confessions increased the suspicions of the investigators. They started checking Levi's social media, trying to track down his recent correspondence and messages. The more information they received, the stronger the impression became that the guy was on the verge of an emotional breakdown. Investigators also learned that Levi spent a lot of time alone, had virtually no close friends, and, according to some classmates, he had become increasingly withdrawn in recent months. He was immersed in online games, was interested in guns, and actively studied topics related to violence. At the same time, the police continued to search for any material traces that could help establish his location. The first major advance in the investigation occurred a few hours after the discovery of the bodies at the Norwood home. Forensics found footprints leading from the basement toward the backyard. There, on the damp ground, shoe prints were visible. They corresponded to the size and model that Levi usually wore. These footprints indicated that the guy left the house immediately after the shooting and probably took a gun with him. The police organized large-scale search activities in the vicinity of the house. Tracking dogs were involved and tried to pick up a trail leading from the Norwood house towards the woods. But suddenly, the trail ended. This suggested that Levi could have used the car to escape. This was also confirmed by the fact that one of the cars belonging to the family had disappeared from the garage. While the police were conducting search operations, Josh Norwood, while in the hospital, gave his first testimony. He was still in a state of shock, but he was trying to remember everything that could shed light on what had happened. Levi, he wasn't like he used to be, Josh said, lying in a hospital bed with a bandage on his head. He became withdrawn, distanced himself from us. I thought it was just adolescence. I couldn't imagine that it would go this far. These words were a bitter confirmation that the family was going through internal conflicts that Josh might not have been fully aware of. Investigators began to reconstruct the picture of the last months of Levi's life. They learned that there were frequent quarrels between father and son. Josh was a strict father who demanded discipline, and Levi, like many teenagers, aspired to independence, which only increased the tension. One of Levi's teachers told police that the guy was increasingly skipping classes and seemed depressed. However, no one imagined that his internal conflicts could lead to such terrible consequences. By the end of the first day of the investigation, the police had issued an orientation for Levi Norwood and his car. They also spread information that the teenager may be armed and dangerous. There were still a lot of questions. What exactly was the trigger for these murders? Why did Levi kill his mother and brother? And where is he now? The next day, the search activities continued. All the nearest gas stations, cafes, motels were checked, any places where Levi might appear. By then, news of the Norwood family murders had already spread through local and national media. People were shocked. The tragedy that occurred in a small and seemingly prosperous family on Valentine's Day was a real shock to society.
The 17-year-old was arrested the next day at a Target store in Durham, North Carolina, where
About 2 days after the start of the investigation, an important event occurred. Police officers patrolling the roads closest to the crime scene noticed a car that matched the description of the car that disappeared from the Norwood garage. The car was parked in the parking lot of a small store. The officers approached the car, but it was empty. However, an inspection showed that the car belonged to the Norwood family. This was confirmed by the registration data. Not far from the store, the police saw a teenager matching Levi's description. He was walking along the road. He had nothing in his hands, but his face was pale. His eyes were strained. The officers began to slowly approach him, giving commands not to move. Levi stopped but did not try to run away. He looked tired and haggard, as if he had been hiding somewhere in the woods or other remote places all this time to avoid capture. When the police arrested Levi, he did not resist. No weapons were found in his pockets, but during interrogation, he almost immediately admitted his guilt. The teenager was silent, answered questions in monosyllables, but the investigators understood that he was responsible for the deaths of his mother and brother. Later, during interrogations, Levi said that on that fateful Friday, he could not stand the internal tension. Quarrels with his father, a sense of loneliness and alienation, pushed him to take decisive action. According to him, he planned the murders in advance, knowing that his father would be late returning from work. How did it help to find the culprit? The arrest of Levi Norwood was the culmination of an intense search, but the investigation did not end there. Despite his confession, investigators had to figure out the details of what led to the tragedy and how the teenager came to such a cruel decision. The investigation sought not only to confirm his guilt, but also to reveal the internal motives that led to the murder, as well as to understand how Levi managed to hide after the massacre of his family. During the interrogations, which took place with the participation of psychologists, Levi gradually began to tell his version of events. It was a complicated story, intertwined with teenage fears, feelings of loneliness, and deep inner conflict. According to Levi, the tension in their family has been building up for several years. It seemed to him that his parents, especially his father, did not understand him and put too much pressure on him. Every day he felt a wall of misunderstanding growing between him and his parents, which increasingly alienated him from his family. It all started with minor conflicts. Josh Norwood was a strict and demanding father who adhered to discipline. He wanted his sons to grow up responsible and purposeful. However, Levi's teenage years turned out to be difficult. The guy withdrew into himself, spending more time alone, immersing himself in computer games and going into the world of the internet. Quarrels with his father over school performance, discipline, and other issues became more frequent and emotionally difficult for Levi. Levi told investigators that he felt like an outsider in his own family. He began to worry that his parents loved his younger brother Wyatt more than himself. The youngest son was always the center of attention, received more affection and care, which caused Levi to feel jealous and detached. With each new quarrel, his negative emotions intensified until they reached the point of no return. According to Levi, by the time he committed the murder, he had been considering this step for several months. It all started with fantasies of just disappearing from home, running away, starting a new life somewhere far away from my parents and brothers. However, later these thoughts turned into sinister plans. He began to think that violence might be the only way out for him. Gradually, his plans took shape. He decided to kill his family and escape. That Friday, February 14th, Levi waited for his father to leave for work. He had prepared a weapon in advance, a pistol that was kept in the house. Levi knew perfectly well where his father kept the key to the gun safe and took advantage of this knowledge. Before committing the crime, he hid in the basement, waiting for his mother and brother to be alone in the house. Jen, as usual, was doing household chores, and Wyatt was with her. Levi did not give his mother a chance to realize what was happening. He approached her from behind and shot her in the back while she was standing in the living room. Jen fell to the floor before she realized what had happened. Wyatt, sitting in the love seat nearby, was next. Levi pointed the gun at his brother and shot him in the chest in cold blood. After that, Levi covered his brother's body with a blanket, as if trying to hide what he had done or create the illusion that it was just a dream.
Murderer, I called his son until that act. Must have ran once he heard me yell, as he knew his ambush shot failed.
After the murder, Levi returned to the basement, waiting for his father to return. He knew that Josh had to come home from work late and planned to meet him with a shot. When Josh entered the house and was injured, Levi did not have time to take further action, as his father immediately ran through the house in search of his family. At that moment, Levi realized that his plan might not work. He decided that the safest thing to do was to escape, taking a weapon with him. After Josh fired in the direction of the basement, Levi left the house through the back door and headed into the woods, where he hid the weapon. The details of the plan and its cold-blooded execution amazed the investigators. Levi did not show much emotion during the story, which caused the staff who questioned him even more concern. He described his actions as if he was talking about something mundane and not about the brutal murder of his family. After the interrogation, the police immediately sent teams to search for hidden weapons and traces of Levi in the places he described. The weapon was found in the woods near the house, confirming his testimony. After Levi Norwood's arrest, the investigation continued, but investigators had already gathered enough evidence to press charges of double murder. From the very beginning, the case gained a wide public response. Local and national media actively covered the incident, and the public was shocked by the brutality of the crime and the fact that it was committed by a teenager against his own family. Prosecutors have charged Jen Norwood and her youngest son Wyatt with first-degree murder, as well as the attempted murder of Josh Norwood. Levi's trial began a few months after his arrest. It did not cause a protracted debate, as the key circumstances were clear from the very beginning. Levi gave a full confession during the interrogations. His testimony coincided with the evidence found, including weapons and traces of his movements. However, the trial aroused great public interest for two reasons. Firstly, everyone expected to hear how the teenager would explain his behavior, and secondly, because of the issue of Levi's mental health. From the very beginning of the trial, Levi's defense focused on his emotional state and instability. The lawyers argued that Levi suffered from depression and was mentally unstable, which led him to commit a terrible crime. During the court sessions, psychologists testified, explaining that Levi was in a state of deep depression, felt alienated, and was subjected to constant pressure from his family, especially from his father. One of the expert psychologists stated, "Levi perceived his position in the family as hopeless. There was no other way out for him but violence. The condition he was in did not allow him to adequately assess the consequences of his actions." It is important to note that Levi did not have a diagnosis that would directly indicate a serious mental illness that could be the basis for the application of insanity. But the defense tried to prove that the teenager's condition was so unstable that he could not fully control his actions. The prosecutor's office, in turn, focused on the fact that Levi had planned the murders in advance. They provided the court with evidence confirming that he had been thinking about his actions for several weeks, that the weapons were prepared in advance, and that the murders were committed in cold blood. This was not an outburst of anger or a spontaneous act of violence, the chief prosecutor said at one of the meetings. Levi Norwood has carefully thought out his actions. He knew what he was doing and had the opportunity to abandon this plan, but he did not do it. The hearings continued for several weeks, during which the jury and the judge listened to both evidence of Levi's guilt and defense arguments about his mental state. Special attention was paid to the moment when Josh Norwood, a survivor of the attack, gave his testimony. When Josh appeared in court, he looked exhausted and devastated. His face still bore the marks of injury from the injuries sustained on that ill-fated day. However, the deepest wound was emotional. He had lost his wife and youngest son, and now had to testify against his eldest son. There was an oppressive silence in the courtroom as Josh described the events of that day and his first encounter with horror when he saw the bodies of his family.
The father of the Fauquier County teenager accused of murdering his mother and brother is making his first public comments.
I returned home expecting to see my family as always, but instead I found my wife dead, my son, and then I heard gunshots. Josh said, barely holding back tears. He didn't try to justify Levi, but he didn't hate him either. Josh spoke with bitterness and regret, and his testimony became one of the key points in the trial. He told the court about his difficult relationship with Levi, how they often quarreled, but he never could have thought that everything would go so far. "I loved him," Josh said, "but I didn't see how much he was suffering. I didn't see it." The prosecutor's final word was decisive. He insisted that Levi was sane at the time of the crime and was aware of what he was doing. Despite the possible problems in the family, this did not justify such a cruel act. The prosecutor demanded the maximum punishment for Levi, stressing that this crime could not remain without severe punishment. After several days of deliberation, the jury returned a verdict. Levi Norwood was found guilty of the murders of his mother and younger brother, as well as the attempted murder of his father. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The court took into account his age, but refused to recognize him as mentally insane. The society reacted to this case with deep shock. In the small town where the tragedy occurred, people were shocked that such a brutal murder had occurred in their midst. The Norwood family seemed outwardly prosperous, and few could have imagined that such deep conflicts were accumulating in their home. Local residents discussed this event for a long time, and many could not believe that the teenager was capable of such a crime. The Levi Norwood case has become a symbol of the devastating effects of emotional isolation and conflict within the family. Although outwardly the Norwood family seemed ordinary and prosperous, behind the facade there was a tense relationship that eventually led to tragedy. The attention paid to adolescent problems, mental health, and the dynamics of family relationships was a key result of this high-profile case. This story has become a reminder that even the smallest conflicts, if not resolved, can lead to catastrophic consequences.